I guess, acquire or die painfully. We certainly should make considerable progress in the next hour because we have with us a professional student of
The
hippies,
topic tonight is the
as also
hippie,
someone who is said
and understanding
to
of
have
whom we
started
must,
the
I guess,
whole
acquire or
beat
die
generation
painfully.
business, and finally
We
a
certainly
hippie
should
type
make
who
considerable
can correct
progress
us
in the next hour because
ever
we have
so
with us
gently, please,
a professional
if
student
we
of
are
hippies,
wrong.
as also
Mr.
someone who
Louis
is said to have
Yablonsky
started the whole
is a
beat
sociologist who
generation
studied at Rutgers
business,
and took his
and
doctorate at
finally
New
a
York
hippie
University
type who can
and
correct
teaches
us
at San Fernando
ever so
State
gently,
College,
please,
California,
if
where
we're
he is
wrong.
chairman of his department.
Mr. Louis
His first
Yablonsky
book,
is
which
a
focused on
sociologist who studied at
teenage
Rutgers
gang
and
life
took
and
his
drug
doctorate
addiction,
at New York
prepared him for
University
his magnum
and
opus, which
teaches
is
at
called
San Fernando
The
State
Hippie
College in
Trip,
California,
a first-hand
where he is
account
chairman
of the
his
beliefs
department.
and behavior
His first
of
book,
hippies in America.
which focused on
Mr.
teenage gang
Jack
life and
Kerouac
drug
over here
addiction, prepared him
became
for his
famous
magnum
when
opus,
his
which
book
is
On the
called
Road was published.
The Hippie Trip,
It
a
seemed
first-hand
to be
account
preaching
of
a
the
life of
beliefs and behavior of hippies in
making a
America.
virtue out.
Mr. Jack Kerouac over here became famous when his book On the Road was published. It seemed to be preaching a life of disengagement, making a virtue out of restlessness. The irony is that when the book was belatedly published in 1958, 7 years after it was written, Mr. Kerouac had fought his way out of the beat generation and is now, if not exactly orthodox, at least a regular practicing novelist whose 13th book, The Vanity of Doulos, is widely regarded as his best. Mr. Ed Sanders is a musician, a poet, and a polemicist. He is one of the Fugs, a widely patronized combo. He has published 4 books of poetry and has vigorously preached pacifism for a number of years. I should like to begin by asking Mr. Sanders whether we have serious terminological problems. For instance, are you a hippie, Mr. Sanders, and if not, wherein not?
Well, I'm not exactly a hippie. I mean, I have certain sentiments for that, quote, hippie movement, unquote. I would say that I'm different from the hippies in that I would have a more radical political solution to the problems of this part of the century. And I have my roots more strongly in, say, the classical tradition and in poetry and literature, rather than in dope and street sex.
This you think...
and you published that magazine called what?
Called Gutter Expletive, a magazine of the arts.
Well, now, do I understand from this that we are supposed to make the inference that the hippies don't have a highly developed political schedule, a highly developed political ideology.
Is it the problem with the terms like hippie is that they have a definition foisted on them by the media, and that the word hippie is has been limited by the necessities of the type of journalists that promote it, and you know, you can't rely on the name hippie to include a human being. You know, everything about a particular human being. You know, so it's a bad term, I think, because it has no meaning. You might think of hippopotamus, and I mean, you know, it's like it has no other connections, spiritual and emotional, like say the Beat generation title had. You know, it had other implications. But the word hippie, you immediately think of you don't have any good connections. Sometimes.
I kind of disagree with that. I spent last year traveling around the country. Various communes and various Haight-Ashbury, Lower East Side, various city scenes, and there was an identifiable, I define a hippie as a rather, generally a young person in several categories. There's kind of a priestly type. I would include Allen Ginsberg and Tim Leary and individuals like that in that category. People searching for some loving solutions to society's ills, trying to tune into the cosmos, whatever that means. We can explore that. Generally using psychedelic drugs, and then there's a whole cadre of individuals whom I've termed novices, who are attempting to achieve a certain transcendental state. And there's a lot of teeny bopper kids who are sort of hanging on. Then there's some ancient folks like Kerouac here who... Why couldn't you keep quiet while I was talking? I'll keep quiet when you talk.
Yeah, yes, that's a fair enough, isn't it?
What?
I think that's fair enough, your
You
request.
said cadre. It's cadre.
Well, I'm sorry.
Spanish
I
word.
apologize.
Right.
My semantics aren't...
And I showed my thumbs down to Ginsberg over there in the back.
Oh, he's a nice fella.
Yeah, we'll throw him to the lions.
Well, what about it, Mr. Kerouac? You're exercised about something, or by something.
Restless
what
is
it
true.
that,
You had the right word. Restless is right.
Well, what is it that that in your judgment distinguishes the hippie movement from, for instance, or simply a routine
Get your
radical
question over
political
with.
movement?
No, I interrupted your sentence. Sentence.
Yeah, I say what distinguishes the hippie movement from simply an orthodox radical, say,
Nothing.
Adamite movement?
Adamite?
There was a
Adam and Eve, or atom?
Adam. As in Adam and Eve.
What's an Adam and Eve? What's Adamite? Where they all wear their hair long, layers, in caves?
Yeah, and sort of back to nature and
well, that's all right.
Exclusive concern for
They might
one's
have
own
to, in due time,
pleasure.
after the Adamite bomb.
Hey, that was good, wasn't it?
Good all the time, boy.
Give that man a drink. Now, Jack, Mr. Kerouac, what I want to ask is this. To what extent do you believe that the Beat generation is related to the hippies?
Oh,
what do they have in common? Was this an evolution from the one to the other?
It's just the older ones.
Yeah.
I'm 46 years old. These kids are 18. It's the same movement, which is apparently some kind of Dionysian movement in late civilization, and which I did not intend any more than I suppose Dionysius did, or whatever his name was. But although I'm not Dionysius the Areopagite, I should have been.
Yeah, that's the point, yeah.
No, it's just a movement which is supposed to be licentious, but it isn't really.
Well, now, licentious in what respect?
The hippies are good kids. They're better than the Beat. The Beats, see, Ginsberg and I, and, well, Ginsberg, boy. We're all in our 40s, and we started this, and the kids took it up and everything. But a lot of hoodlums, and communists jumped on our backs. Well, on my back, not his. Ferlinghetti jumped on my back and turned the idea that I had that the Beat generation was a generation of beatitude and pleasure in life and tenderness. But they called it in the papers Beat mutiny, Beat insurrection. Words I never used. Being a Catholic, I believe in order, tenderness, and piety.
Well, then your point was that a meeting, that a movement which you conceived as relatively pure has become ideologized and misanthropic and generally
a movement that was
objectionable.
No, a movement that was considered what?
Pure.
Yes, it was pure in my heart.
What about that, Mr. Blanc? Do you see that as having happened somewhere between the Beats and the hippies?
I think there's, in early 67, going back to around, I suppose, 64 or 5, there were a lot of people trying to kind of return to sort of an Indian style of life or relate to the land differently, trying to love each other and communicate, be more open with each other. And I think recently it's taken a turn in a violent direction. A lot of responsibility, I think, is due to drugs like methadone, the amphetamines, and perhaps the overuse, because it's been around for quite a while now, of drugs like LSD.
How about the herring?
What is herring? Is that kind of a drug?
It's a cherry herring.
No.
Kerouac still is out
herring.
of style. He's still on alcohol, which is.
I'm on alcohol.
There are other drugs now.
How about that, Miss Sanders? Is that out of style?
Well, you mentioned misanthropic and objectionable. I think that
Misanthropic.
many of the so-called misanthropic elements of this generation are due to the war, and that you have a surly generation of draft-eligible but literate and articulate people who are confronted with the hideous probability of having to go to an Asian land war, and that so they have to go to war, and they're faced with this looming, gloomy future, and that rather than die in Vietnam, they'd rather prepare themselves to articulate a lifestyle in the streets and in the open that really reflects something they really want to do, rather than this other thing they have to do later on that they don't really believe in and they will do because push comes to shove. Most kids go to war. You know.
Of course, the trouble with that is it doesn't account, for instance, for the restlessness in, say, Paris, where they don't have that particular problem, does it?
Well, that's the up against
Who's
the wall
Daniel
syndrome. I mean,
Cohn-Bendit?
Mr. Sanders, I'm interested in trying to pin this point down because a lot of us have heard that the restlessness of so much of American youth, which has contributed to the growth of the hippie movement, has to do with the trauma of Vietnam. But then all of a sudden, a while ago in France, what seemed like the entire student population exploded, even though that particular provocation was singularly, in fact conspicuously, absent, France having been officially very pro-North Vietnam, very anti-American. Now, how do you account for that, and has it caused you to perhaps look into more generic sources of
I think
disorder?
it's the nefarious occurrence in French civilization of Madame de Gaulle.
Madame de Gaulle?
Because she has exercised a noxious influence on French television, sitting up and personally censoring it. And I think, it's absolutely true. And I think that when you have a type of obnoxious matriarchy, as that's evident in France, plus a encrusted, boorish university structure, and the old man himself. And who wouldn't? I mean, it's the whole thing to God. There's a huge structure there to revolt against.
So Madame de Gaulle is roughly equal to Vietnam.
She's Madame Nu.
Professor Yablonsky, what would you say if a student of yours told you that?
Well, I think in the United States, the hippies, with all the tantamount difficulties of defining them, come from the middle, upper classes, upper socioeconomic situation. And these are generally people who have tasted the best that American society seems to have to offer. They have access to all the goodies, and they're turned off by it. They feel that it's kind of a plastic society. There's no room for political change. I'm talking about the pure hippie. The pure hippie isn't particularly involved in politics. He sort of retreats from that. He's withdrawn from it. And he's involved in, I mentioned the term cosmic consciousness before. There is an experience one seems to get under LSD that a lot of people talk about as putting them in touch with all things, with all people. And there's an effort, kind of an extremist effort at love that seems to dominate the hippie scene, and a retreat from politics.
Well, is there a causal relation between they're adopting these attitudes and the Vietnam War, or do you reject the Vietnam War as the proximate cause of this movement?
The Vietnam War is part of it.
But if there had been no Vietnam War, we might have had the identical thing. Is that your point?
Well, I think there are a lot of, there's no single cause for a particular movement. I think part of it may have been the assassination of JFK. I think people on the left felt that through the establishment, through political devices, the society could move in other directions, and then...
in what direction was it moving in 1963 that was pleasing to them?
There was a movement towards greater welfare programs, towards resolving in some ways the civil rights issue. There seemed to be some hope, and then this seemed to be snapped off, and a lot of kids who went to Mississippi...
If I may say so, precisely the movements that didn't get passed in 1961, 62, and 63, of the kind you just enumerated, were passed in 64, 65, 66. So there would seem to be almost a negative correlation between the civil rights legislation and welfare passages and the growth of the movement.
I think if you can cross-compare the limited JFK administration and the rather lengthy LBJ administration, I think the LBJ situation has kind of been going through the motions of doing something. And there was a certain, I feel, and a lot of people have told me this, spirit afoot in the country. And there seemed to be a bit of a revival with Bobby Kennedy, and here again, and to some extent the McCarthy involvement. And I think a lot of people are turned off from the political establishment because they don't see any hope for changing it. That is, they use terms like plastic and more severe words about it, and they've disengaged. They're uncommitted to it.
How about that, Mr. Kerouac? Does that make sense to you in terms of
I lost the entire train of thought.
Well, the train of thought has to do with whether in the last few years people have ceased to look at the political processes as profitable in terms of bringing on the kind of world they want to live in, and maybe that has something to do with the assassination of Kennedy, that kind of thing.
No, that was an accident. I refer back to Count Leo Tolstoy, who wrote War and Peace, you know, Leo Tolstoy, who said that at one time the hourglass, that the sand is coming down from one top of the hourglass down to the other, and that will be the end of war. I think that war will be over fairly soon. Although I don't know for sure. That's what Tolstoy said. And he was the guy who taught Gandhi and Thoreau.
Yeah.
Henry David Thoreau.
Yeah. Told him a lot of foolish things.
No, but I didn't get the full context of your question.
Well, the full context of the question is, are a significant number of Americans precisely at an age when we enunciated the Great Society.
Oh, Great Society.
I.e. the society that was actually going to introduce politics
As
as
far as I'm
relevant in
concerned-
everything. Are they disillusioned, and does this have to do with the growth of the hippie movement?
In the first place, I think that the Vietnamese War is nothing but a plot between the North Vietnamese and the South Vietnamese, who are cousins, to get jeeps in the country. And as for...
They're not very good plotters, are they?
Well, they got a lot of jeeps. I think they're pulling the wool over our eyes, and we're little American lambs.
They turned out to be more expensive than Sears Roebuck Jeeps.
Yes.
Didn't they?
But that's what I really think there. As for the Russian takeover of Czechoslovakia, that showed the world what they're like, what the communists are really like. They're really fascists.
Well, yeah, I don't guess anybody doubted that except maybe Mr. Sanders, right?
No, I think it was a terrible thing, you know. And if I were in Czechoslovakia and a Czechoslovakian student, I'd be putting out an underground newspaper and doing my best.
Called what?
Called Gutter Expletive.
Well, since you are in Czechoslovakia, Mr. Sanders, what do you consider it appropriate to do in the United States?
During the presidential campaign?
Yeah, by way of protest against the Czechoslovakian business.
Oh, well, I recommend sit-ins in front of the Russian missions.
What for?
To vigorously and more forcefully yet non-violently to witness against it. And I would advocate writing articles and advocate maybe going to Czechoslovakia. I mean, the thugs are going to Europe in a couple of weeks, and we may
You're going to bring your carbines?
We're going to the Essen Song Festival in Germany. We just may try to freak across to Czechoslovakia to visit Kafka's birthplace, I guess. Was he born in Prague? Yeah.
Yeah.
So we may go have a homage to Kafka with our band.
Well, do you draw any generalities on the basis of the behavior of the Soviet Union, which instruct you in assessing other political situations?
Like Mayor Daley in Chicago.
Mm-hmm. And what are those?
Well, those are that when you attempt to essentially peacefully gather together to press a point about a war or about a freedom or about freedom of journalism, that when you're confronted with people like like the Soviet leaders and like the leaders in Chicago, namely Mayor Daley and Mr. Stahl and Mr. Barger of the Chicago municipal office, that you're confronted with essentially the same position. You're allowed, you're clubbed, you're maced, you're gassed, you're freaked, zapped, pushed over. If you're an old lady, you're thrown through a plate glass window. If you're a cripple, you're thrown against a street light. If you're a peaceful, long-haired, loving protester, you're smashed and knocked down. If you're a cameraman, you're bricked and your camera's destroyed, and your blood is splattered all over you. I mean, it's a nefarious scene, and there's all kinds of correlations. And the lesson you would draw would be to prepare yourself, and in the sense of if you're nonviolent like I am, and if you believe in pacifism, you will attempt to create a body of love and light, so that thing can't happen, that there'll be so many loving people there that you will have a festival of life and all its attributes, and you can do that by praying together, by loving together, by Alan was singing Aum in the streets, which is the Hindu benevolent word, and by getting together and creating love, I think it's a great force, and at least in allowing you to demonstrate in the United States against Daley, who is like it's Al Capone,
Yes,
I mean, it's,
Yeah, sure.
Beware of false prophets who come unto you dressed in sheep's clothing, and underneath they are ravening wolves.
But who's that?